Okay. I think the agenda looks pretty light. Maybe you can just run through it and then we can spend the rest of the time chatting. And if anyone wants to hop off, that's not interested in us talking about SPDX, you can hop off. um, so I think Ben, you have an update on the Trustify. I saw your talk. Sorry, I didn't manage to get to it before I left.
Yeah, so just a quick status update. LF drew up the necessary paperwork for Red Hat to transfer the trademarks, etc. They sent that on Friday, so that is Dayon has sent that on to the appropriate people at Red Hat, and so that's where we are with it. So basically, just need signatures at this point. So hopefully that'll be buttoned up here pretty soon.
Awesome. I guess a quick question on that. Like, how long did it take with the GUAC 1.0 blog post for them to get back to us and okay it?
Uh, let me go back and look at my email. So we got the first round of feedback in basically a week. So I'd sent it to them on Monday, and we had feedback by the end of by that Friday. And then I sent them the final on Wednesday. Um, and then we just basically at that point, we were mostly just waiting on the actual release to happen so that we could, um, link to our blog post and stuff. So I would, if we're planning on doing something, I would say, kind of plan for 2 weeks total. And obviously, if we wanted to draft something now and then, hold it until everything was locked down, like that's certainly doable.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think I wanted to get a sense of like when I should maybe reach out to marketing folks on our side to help Signal boost it.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, Sounds like I should reach out now because that doesn't take too long. All right, thanks, Ben. Uh, you also had a proposal to cancel next week's meeting because of the Denver summit. I'm good for this. I know some other folks may have traveling. Uh, Jeff and Santiago, are you going to be there as well?
Yeah, I'll be there.
Uh, I don't know. I still don't know. uh, yeah, let's see how the plane tickets look like.
Oh, it's not that far of a drive.
I actually wanted to ask a local. How bad is it? Have you done it?
I haven't. Distance wise, I would probably do it, but having to drive through like Nebraska is an endurance challenge just from the flatness of in like eastern Colorado. It's
Oh,
very flat and there's just not a lot of
I drove from Denver to San Diego once, and that flatness around like I think it was like New Mexico and Nevada and stuff like that. I forget the exact path. It was also pretty rough.
Well, it sounds like Ben is proposing carpool.
Why don't we do a road trip?
In the guac taco truck.
Yeah, we can rent a U-Haul painted green.
All right, yeah, it sounds like consensus is majority are gonna be there, so I think we can cancel.
I'll do the needful with operations then.
All right, thanks, Ben. Did you have any issues with the permissions? I think it should be done.
I think everything is good at this point.
Okay, okay, cool. Um, Any other topics? If not, we can have a chit chat about SPX tree. All right. Yeah, just being mindful that this may be just like um a bit of a niche topic. Feel free to drop off if it goes too far into the roots, the weeds of things. Yeah, I think one of the changes in SPX trio model uh, is that initially in SPDX we had these things called documents, right? And the documents had describe a particular artifact, the artifact had relationships and stuff like that. The model has moved towards like here's a document, it points to a particular set of nouns and verbs. And the metadata is it's kind of just like here's a bunch of nodes and here's a bunch of edges, right? And so there's a little bit of a conflict in terms of when we talk about a SPX document. Usually, like here's a document, here's all the information. In SPX2, I think there wasn't a lot of ability to say like whether things were complete or things were incomplete. We talk about SPX tree being like a graph format, and so like you have this knowledge base, you're getting information, and it keeps on getting augmented, right? Now, I think there's a little bit of a split view where people are still treating it like a document of here's an SBOM, here's what it describes, and some people are treating it as like here are relationships and here's what here's a list of relationships and nouns. Now there has been a lot of questions on like the way that people process and consume SPX has been per document, and it isn't designed to be streaming, right? So like if you're saying that here's an individual document that um, contain relationships and you would kind of build up the picture, there isn't a clear story on like when is it safe to ask questions about those things. And I don't think that's fleshed out at all yet. There is a kind of very philosophical that yes, like technically this data can be used as a graph and it will enable that use case. But as far as like while we were developing the trio model, um, we then come up with a set of like examples of how it would be consumed. Right? I think we have an idea that yeah, it would be able to be consumed that way, but then we don't have a way to say like, oh, how would you be able to like checkpoint certain things to say that you're not in a place where yeah, you process like half the information and then you're making decisions on incomplete information. Right? Um,
So, yeah, the reason why I wanted to talk about it is it is very. I guess that there's a very close relationship between WAC and SPDX if at 3.0, I would guess. And I don't know, maybe I'm just like not up to date with the current status of the like WAC architecture, but I kind of wonder how things would change. For example, with the SBOM tooling that we've been writing for like diffing and comparing SBOMs, uh, if there's something interesting in there. I played with their visualizer, like I think it's called Daughter or something like that. It felt a little bit limited, but it was mostly. I guess that I don't know, Brandon. You're in both places. Do you think there's something there to say like, hey, why don't you add support for like 3.0 nodes or verbs or something like that, and what would it entail?
um, I think I see the 3.0 just like a regular extension of like we write we have a parser for SPTX2. We don't necessarily pass everything because either they're not really widely adopted, or um, there isn't a good understanding, or there isn't a good um, guidance on how those relationships are used. So we've modeled, for example, like the contains, the dependencies, the pearls, all those things, right? To me, SPX Trio is a little bit of a refactor of SPX2. So I think overall relationships are all still the same. We have pulled out some to be be a little bit more specific, like when you have contains, like we encode like the build stuff, we can encode some stuff about like AI data sets. But it is pretty much just like an extension of that model. No, I think that the consumption story is still difficult, right? I think that you have the relationships. You still can't treat the relationships as global relationships in a sense, right? You still have that snowflake problem, remember with Java, right? As far as I know, this is still not solved, right? So if you look at a single SPX document as a graph, yeah, sure, that's like self-consistent. If you take multiple SPX documents and you put it together, it's still going to look like what we've seen. Nothing has changed within the semantics of how the documents are generated in Trio. Right now, it's just like here's a different format. It's the same information that's provided. There's a little bit more additional metadata, which is helpful. So there may be some identities are more first class in terms of relationships. So we may see more information about identities tying to nouns and verbs, which I think is good. But in terms of solving how do I use information across multiple documents, there's a desire from that community, but I don't think that they are at the point where they're starting to see the problems that we've seen.
I see. Okay, so from what you just told me, then it feels like it hasn't substantially changed from the model that we were assuming SPDX would work with. As in, like, there's more clarity and a little bit of, but like it's almost like still intra-document because you cannot make a full sort of like a knowledge graph with a snowflake problem and so like software identifiers. I don't know if the draft that I had, draft 3.0, also still didn't like authenticate relationships. Is that still the case?
Yeah, they don't do. There is a they have something defined. Wait, let me just bring it up. Um, 1 second. Where's the picture? Oh no, they split up the picture into multiple ones. Let me share my screen. think it's software. No. Um.
Should I be seeing the actual PNG? I think it got stuck on.
Oh, I got stuck on that one. Yeah. Oh, give me a second. Let me find it first because they initially had all this in a one diagram and then they split it up.
I see.
We just open this draw.io file actually, maybe. Um, 1 second. Okay. Oh, they just made it. Oh. I guess it didn't make it. No, it should be somewhere in here. Oh yeah, this one. Integrity method.
I remember I got into a quote unquote fight about it in 2021.
Yeah,
Because the integrity method was so vague. They were like, oh, yeah, you could also add, like, I am Charlie and I really think this is true. Uh,
yeah. I have to say it's one of the things that were not as fleshed out. But I think the idea there, right, which I think is a um a step in the right direction from SPDX2 is that the so-called integrity method is on individual elements rather than on the document.
okay. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But a relationship is not an element.
A relationship is not
So how would you
no.
know that relationship is
Oh
true?
wait, sorry. A relationship is an element.
It's an element. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I
Everything is an
was
element. Yeah.
okay. So I was confused the white arrow and the black arrow.
The white arrow is inherits from, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it, got it, got it. Okay.
Site rent inheritance sucks for most programming languages that are not Java.
Okay. Yeah, I think I guess all of what I was saying is I wonder if there's a story there where we can say like, hey, you can use WAC to harmonize a bunch of like SPDX elements data. Still feel sometimes it's a little bit too daunting of a spec, even though the profile effort was trying to make it simpler.
Yeah. I think I see, and at least my perspective of it is that one, like SPDX is huge, right? Like I think you made a comment that's like what, multi domain or something like that, which is true, right? Like they have security, they have license, they have safety, and they have there's like some people just use it as a compliance document, right? Like th- there are a lot of different use cases. I think what GUAC is doing is like one is like we are filtering down and narrowing just on the set of use cases and the set of things which is mapped to user journeys that we know and understand. Um, and then second one is like one is we're filtering down that whole list, and then part two of it is also we are figuring out how to consume those things. Right? So today, if someone queries SPDX, you have to know like, oh, this thing depends on this other thing, right? does this mean that I just query for a contains dependency? I guess in 2.0, right, I have contains, I have depends on, like, what are the list of relationships that I have to query in order to figure that out? And then,
Yeah.
like, do I have to query all the way down? Or like, am I just querying once and like the graph will resolve it for me? Is it flattened already? Um, yeah, and like taking that complexity and abstracting it away. I think that's philosophically how I see it. Yeah, I don't know whether others have different
Okay.
views on that. So yeah. So I think that one thing I would say is that Kate does see GUAC as like complementary. I don't think that is a question of like what we're doing is uh, a competitor to SPDX and doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I didn't get the impression anybody hinted at them competing with each other. Back, I guess, I guess there's two SPDXs. There's the SBOMs that are running to the in the wild, and the ones that, for example, we have on WAC data. That I feel those are like instantiations of like 2.2, and we, as far as I'm concerned, we take those as a single node, give or take. And then we decompose it into a bunch of relationships plus a node. And then when we analyze them, we're doing something that I think if we were to think about this 3.0 spec a little bit further, we could probably do like the SBOM diffing and SBOM sort of like uh, analysis, maybe a little more interesting. But I don't know if I'm just like getting ahead of where like the SPDX 3.0 effort is, and maybe things haven't been fully crystallized on like the software profile and the security profile, and what exactly would be the result of like thinking of WAC being SPDX, maybe not even compliant, but like XPDX knowledgeable to like kind of like exploit everything that's inside of it.
I think that to me is part of it, just like as an extension of 2.0, right? It's just like, yeah, if we pass 2.0 and people are moving from 2.0 to 3.0, we want to pass 3.0 as well. I think that's a natural extension of it. And if 3.0 has more information that we can use, why not? I think. Um, but also, here's an interesting thing, right? So there is, I guess, a little bit of tension in the sense of like SPDX has this thing called like external references, right? So they say like, oh, here's a CVE I'm referencing. Oh, here's a back statement I'm referencing. Oh, um, maybe provenance, right? Here's an in total attestation I'm referencing. Now there is a kind of discussion that has happened where people argue about should SPDX encode the information in this external documents or not. Um, and I think that's we have people on opposing sides of it. And so that's the question also where like, yeah, we need to get the SPX documents, but then at the same time we see, oh, we have external references to other documents. We need to be able to understand and interpret them as well. Um,
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be on those calls, to be honest. Uh, it's like very stressful. Uh, no, I don't know. I think there's at that point becomes a little bit idiosyncratic, right? So I think the mission statement of SPDX that I'm, or like the signals that I'm getting is that it really wants to be all encompassing. Like, it really wants to cover every single aspect of a computing stack, right? So in that sense, it's almost like it needs to subsume every other standard in order to do so.
I think that's, to me, it's a communication. Like SPDEX is the data model, like it's a data model, right? Um, and it is a supposed to be like an ontology for the entire compute, like describe compute. Um, but it doesn't, the tooling of how to use that data model isn't part of the spec, right? It's not kind of like, in OCI, the container images, they have like, here's the spec, here's how you use the spec, how you write the distribution system, here's how you write the runtime system. It's not opinionated in that way, right? Um, there's pros
Yeah,
and cons, yeah. So like,
I was just remembering I was in a reproducible builds call in 2017 when we were told like, oh, you can use SPDX for reproducible builds, and we're like, yeah, but how? And they were like, well, it's I was like, I remember somebody said like, oh yeah, we can spit out the like build infos in that format, and they were like, it's not a format, it's an ontology, and we're like, okay, how do I use that then? And I think that's, but that's I guess a separate conversation as to like how do you make the spec more actionable?
yeah, I guess that's the thing, right? It's like when you say something like here's a build info file, right? I think that is like, here's the information on details of the build, but at the same time, the fact that you're getting a build info file that comes in that like maybe an extension or something tells you about how you should use it. Right? I think that's a question where SPDX data model doesn't answer that, where you can get information like that's so maybe the question is, right, like I know what information build info has. Now if I chance upon a random SVX document and I see a bunch of similar relationships in nouns, am I going to do the same thing with that? Like, am I going to take that and try and reproduce a build? And I think the answer usually is no.
Yeah, well, I think that's the other problem. It does feel like you get an SPDX document, and in order to make value of it, it's like you're diffusing a bomb. It's like, yeah, this could be a built info file, or this could just be like licensing and like and associated facts. I don't know, but I guess, yeah. I mean, I haven't participated enough to like make a very strong statements on where SPDX is at right now. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's a well, I kind of, I think this conversation gave me a lot of clarity on that. All right. It's like, yes, we can. A lot of the relationships are very factual, but the intention has to be able to be expressed as well.
Yeah, I ironically have a project on what we call pseudobombs,
Oh no.
uh, and I think they're better, but that's don't crucify me on those. Imagine that you were able to attach a probability to every single relationship and every single SPDX element, and you said like, okay, this thing contains that thing with like 3% probability. You would say like, well, okay, the tool sucks. There's a signal. I'm not going to act on it. Or you could say, hey, the tool contains this other library with 100% probability. I think you could make a little bit better of a like security posture determination based on that, and you could also, because my understanding is that there's a whole family of things that you could argue are only relevant on the sort of like lawsuit domain. Like you
Yeah.
had an SPDX document, uh, you got sued, or somebody got hacked, and now there's a lawsuit. Uh, if you only have a binary sort of like, oh, the entry wasn't there, so I wasn't able to make the determination, or the entry was there but I ignored it because it sucks. We never trust like all of the data on the SBOM. Uh, then you don't have a rich sort of like a view on what exactly is happening.
So I can 100% relate to that. So we have an effort that we are trying to um, we have an effort we're trying to pull together called like um, SBOM quality. And so like the idea is you want to have a measure on like, can I trust this SBOM so that it can be used to do vulnerability scans, or like do I trust it enough? Like if you have an SBOM for a container image with a single scratch container image with a Golang binary, you're like 95% certain that everything's there.
No.
Uh, and then in general, like if you're SBOM and you have a binary that's opaque, right? Like then you're not so sure anymore. Um,
And
so I
this
think
is
yeah.
this is actually why we developed it, because the tools that we're also doing this with is for like behavioral SBOMs. Oh,
What do you mean by behavior response?
so effectively, we developed a tool that sniffs TLS traffic, and it can tell you a bunch of open source stacks on different IoT devices.
Is that the proposal from the NYU
Yeah.
thing?
It's a
Okay,
proposal
yeah, I saw
we've
that.
been submitting together,
Yeah.
but
I
the NSF doesn't like
They
it.
don't like it.
They didn't like
Yeah.
it, ironically enough. I mean, we're submitting it again to NIST, but it's actually very interesting because we throw it at, for example, an IoT device, an Alexa, right? And then it comes back and says like, actually, the only sort of like piece of the puzzle that could solve the traffic that you're seeing is a Linux device that has OpenSSL that's outdated by 10 years with like 80% probability, or one that's outdated by 7 years with like 15% probability. And very, very likely it has this Linux kernel and there's glibc, and there's all of this family of exploits that can associate with that. Um, and then we actually like extract the binary and then analyze the firmware, and then lo and behold, it's like this Alexa device has it's still vulnerable to Heartbleed, right? I mean, it's not running an HTTPS server, but it's interesting like that. And I would assume that there's a whole gamut of things that you can do if we were able to express this level of confidence on SBOMs, because now it's, well, a build SBOM is in theory like higher percent confidence on what's on the binary because it saw it go in, as opposed to an SEIS bomb that's doing like interesting sort of like file hashing and databases and associations. It's probably still better than a behavioral
Yeah.
SBOM. Uh, but now you have this gradient that you can use to reason about the SBOM quality. What are the tools? What is an SBOM better at telling you, depending on when it was created, and so on and so forth. That I think, honestly, it's almost like we just took the SPDX 2.2 standard and added,
Yeah.
how sure are you about this particular object?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and that's that.
I think that's a tricky thing, right? I think that there are two angles that to look at the issue. One of it is, which I think is the most feasible, which is what you're saying, right? It's like we know and understand the capability of the tool, and then we make a decision based on like the inputs that the tool gets, and then the capability of the tool. Um, and then there's another angle which is a little bit harder to reason about, which is like if we have really the ground truth and then we kind of measure all these tools based on that, right? And one is qualitative, one is quantitative.
Yes. I think it's still they connect to each other in interesting ways, I would say. Uh, because you could say once you measure your tool sort of like a capability, you can almost just like put that percentage or that confidence in the whole lesson that's generated from it, right? You can say this SEA tool is at best 80% good.
So I think here's an interesting thing, right? Like we had this realization with see Jeff. We had this realization with scorecards, right? Where it's like they gave us a score, and then like no one could figure out what the score to do with the score. Like in the end, you want to be able to translate the output to something where like, oh, I can make a policy on it. Uh, and like everyone was like, oh, do we like greater than 0.8? Like what?
Yeah, so I think there's a little. So how does this connect to WAC, for example? Is that I think you can turn this into a graph optimization problem too. That you can say, okay, well, I have a bunch of probabilities on different nodes, and some of them are 100%, and they relate to the to nodes that I have less confidence in. Can I raise that confidence based on like a multi-vantage point sort of like knowledge graph perspective? And then you can set the node to 100%. And it goes to what you were saying about this PDX 3.0, that you can say, look, there's no data, facts are still cooking. You better run more tools, you better run more probes, you better look at more open source disclosures, because as far as we know, there's still a lot of gaps and like a lack of confidence on how this pseudobomb can be upgraded to an S-bomb, if this makes sense.
So it's interesting how I think the case where you have certain information that has a certain probability is, I think, well understood, right? Here's a relationship, here's a score on it. I think the quantifying the lack of the unknown unknowns, right, is the main challenge. And I don't think I've convinced myself that of a good way to think about it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in that it's a little tricky to fully establish everything, but this is why we're asking the U.S. government to give us money so that we can have better knowledge.
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to maybe hear a little bit more, because we also have some work around this, and maybe there may be some collaboration there.
I,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about it. As a matter of fact, in the proposal, we do mention like also integrating some of these capabilities on WAC to some extent, like what fits, and that was my hope. I can send you like a description to like a 1 page, 2 page to see what you guys think about it.
Yeah. There's
It's
some
honestly,
interesting, yeah.
yeah, it's a piece of work that I'm very excited about because I think it'll be very good to enable a bunch of different use cases around SBOM quality. I don't know if we told you about that CVE that we found on the Acme, like the Let's Encrypt container. It was the silliest thing. Like we basically said, like, I don't know. I get the metaphor is, you know, robots.txt.
Yeah.
So like when you do pen testings, or at least something that I used to do when I was pen testing myself, was I would take robots.txt and literally like look at those first, right?
Yeah, because that's not what you want. You don't want people to see them.
Exactly. And a lot of the
Yeah.
times it was like admin console no login, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, what we did this time, we're like, oh, let's run an SEA tool and generate a bunch of SBOMs for containers, and then those like asserted files, we throw them away. Like we know that those, like everybody knows what they are, and they probably did
Yeah, yeah,
something about
yeah,
them.
yeah.
So we created a negative SBOM, aka like almost like robots.txt, and look at
Right.
what's in there. And what we ended up finding is like a bunch of secrets, random binaries that are executed, API tokens. Like a bunch of containers have the API token to push themselves inside of Docker Hub,
Oh,
so
I
you can
see.
like
Yeah,
replace the container. And
yeah.
it that was the Let's Encrypt. We got a CVE earlier this year that was like, oh yeah, you could have just replaced the container that generates all the Acme certificates for a bunch of people with something that also steals the Acme certificates, and then like man in the middle half of the internet, and nobody would be none the wiser. Which is very scary, but
Yeah.
I think how it connects to everything here is like we generate these tools that say like this is what's in the container, this is what's in
Yeah.
there, without saying, hey, I actually know 20% of what's in here.
Yeah.
The rest, I don't know, 0% confident that I know what it is, but it is something.
Yeah, so I think Scalable and OSV, they're working on this thing called like full file system accountability. But this is again like more on the just like dependency side, right?
Right.
Just being like, oh, if I binary is like, and they don't have any polls attached to them, something's up, right?
Yeah.
Something I've been trying to suggest to them is also like ecosystem accountability. If they can document which ecosystem these binaries belong to, or like whether they see Debian files and stuff. It's like it's similar to the behavioral as thing, right? Like what are sniff indicators that something lives here? You know, like I found animal poop. That means like
Yeah, that means you need to check your shoes, right?
yeah, yeah. Like is that a bear in the
Yeah.
woods? You know.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's honestly hilarious how much stuff ends up in there. Like a lot of like packages have scripts that generate files. But the way that a lot of these SCA tools work is they take a look at the contents of a package and then they hash those. And then they hash the files in a container and then they say, well, all of these files belong to this package, but anything that's generated during install time, I don't know where it came from. So like
Right.
a lot of things are, for example, like SSH keys that are baked into the container because you install the OpenSSH package.
Mm.
Nobody knows what they are because they're random. Uh, Nobody knows how they got there. Well, we do know they were generated when you install the OpenSSH package, but they don't have a Perl. They're associated with OpenSSH, so you know that they're related to it, but they're all going to be different and they're baked into an image.
I have some ideas here. We should chat separately.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I mean, we're
Um,
running out of time too.
yeah, I see Rohan, you joined the call. Do you want to say hi? Sorry, you had to listen to us bitching
Yeah,
about
yeah, no worries, no worries.
experience.
Hi everyone, hi. Hello, I'm Rohan. I'm from India actually.
Oh, awesome. Thanks. It must be
Yeah,
late there.
yeah. I joined to like see how the workflow goes and how can I probably contribute later on. So yeah, I've got a good idea of the project now and the workflow too. Thanks for the explanations. Yeah,
Yeah, I think you called us, and we some usually we have the first part of the meeting is going through agenda, and usually we spend the entire session going through agenda. Today we had a lot of slack time, so we ended up doing some
yeah.
ad hoc
I know
technical
actually I
discussion.
had another meeting scheduled and had to go there first, and after that ended, I jumped here. So yeah,
Yeah.
I missed the first half.
Awesome. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself? Like, what do you work on? What are you looking to use
Yeah, yeah,
Quark
sure.
for? Yeah.
Yeah, so hello everyone, I'm Rohan from India and I'm a computer science student. I started open source programming since let's say 1 year now. And I am a member of the Open Mainframe project where I am currently a LFX mentee. I'm working on Zoe project and seeing how mainframe works. And I thought, why not just let's see the security part too. So I was
Mm.
like exploring OpenSSF too because they have a lot of things that may be implemented there. So yeah, I'm looking around.
Awesome. Well, welcome. I think you hopefully, if you're not aware, we are on the Slack channel, so you can find us there. We also have
Yeah,
a
yeah,
community. Yeah.
I'm there. I have joined. I always keep an eye for things I can learn. So yeah, I'm everywhere.
Cool. Cool. That's great. That's great.
Yeah,
Awesome. Nice to see you, Rohan.
yeah. Nice to see you all.